Hey everyone, and thanks for taking the time to check out this video. For today's viewer-requested presentation, we will be covering one of my favorite variants of Chinese Type 56 carbine, the so-called Ghost. Fair warning, this will not be a short video, as indeed it is my explicit goal to provide more information on this variant today than you will find from any other single source. That'll include historical context, identification criteria, distinguishing characteristics, collector considerations, relative quality, and probably more historical context peppered throughout. So with that in mind, as usual, I have broken this video up into chapters. So if you're looking for a specific piece of information, those timestamps can be found in the description, and they may be useful for navigating this resource more efficiently. Obviously, there's a lot to cover today, so without further ado, let's dive in. The first thing we need to understand about today's subject is why precisely I will be occasionally qualifying its label as the so-called Ghost, rather than just calling it a ghost. As is so often the case on this channel, I'm being somewhat pedantic and attempting to highlight what I consider to be an intellectually important distinction. In this case, the distinction that I am pointing to is the difference between technical and colloquial terminology. I first introduced this distinction in my What is a Sino-Soviet video, but for those who haven't seen it, the main takeaway is that when people like you and I talk about rifles like these, it often requires us to use a blend of formal and informal classifications. There isn't anything fundamentally wrong with either manner of speaking, but truly curious people may find it helpful to at least be aware of which labels fit into which category, as there are meaningful differences between them. Formal classifications or technical terms are historically defined and inarguable in their meaning. For example, if someone uses terms like long lug, Israeli capture, or M21, they are either right or they are wrong, and there's little room for ambiguity. If 99 people in a room become convinced that this is a Soviet SKS 45, and you are the only person who recognizes it as a Chinese Type 56 carbine, the fact that you're of the minority opinion does not make you any less right. Formal classifications are rooted in absolute truth, and they exist outside of the realm of perception and opinion. Informal classifications or colloquial terms work a little bit differently. The term ghost is an example of a colloquial term, which is not historically defined or inarguable in its meaning. We can and will be associating that term with a formal technical definition. However, the term itself is not intrinsically tied to any absolute truth. The term was adopted and popularized by Western collectors 15 or so years ago and refers to a somewhat arbitrarily defined group of rifles, and relies on a distinction which is exclusively relevant from the perspective of a collector. Specifically, the category is primarily defined by the absence of a factory marking, and the idea of something being absent or invisible is vaguely evocative of ghosts. To borrow my example from earlier, if I somehow ended up in a room with 99 people who were convinced that this variant was now called the Patrick Swayze, and I was the only person in that room who insisted on continuing to call it a ghost, I actually would cease to become correct in that situation. Colloquial terminology is by definition rooted in social consensus rather than empirical reality. Now, I want to be clear that I am not advocating against the use of this term or in any way criticizing the collectors who coined it. It's actually a very useful term for people like myself, and I am acutely aware that I would not be here enthusiastically talking to you fine people if it hadn't been for those people who pioneered this field of study and helped me spark my own interest. I am simply reminding viewers that there isn't actually such a thing as the Chinese ghost rifle. That's just a catchy nickname which we agreed to use to refer to a cosmetically distinct variant of the Type 56 carbine. With all that in mind, I doubt you came to this video to hear about the history of the term ghost, so let's shift to talking about the very real and very cool rifles that this somewhat less real term has become associated with. As a functional definition, a ghost is one of the first approximately 212,000 SKS pattern carbines to be mass-produced in China between the years of 1956 and 1957. They were produced at State Arsenal 296, however, they predate the iconic Triangle 26 Arsenal mark, which would ultimately come to symbolize that factory. Rest assured, we will leave no stone unturned while unpacking those technical details, but first, let's get a sense for the historical context from which these emerged. Given that the Ghosts are first production on rifles, that means we get to focus on my personal favorite part of this story, which is, of course, the beginning. Contrary to worn-out gun shop lore, the Chinese did not rip off the Soviet SKS-45. As hard as it is for some of us to remember, the China that we all know today, that China that rips off everything from sneakers to stealth fighters and is home to apartment buildings that have a bigger internal population than the city I grew up in, that China didn't exist in the 1950s. The China in the 1950s was basically a vast swath of blood-soaked farmland, a country that in the span of a decade had gone toe-to-toe with two of the most dangerous fighting forces on the planet. That would be the Japanese in the 1940s and the Americans in the 1950s. And even still, they found time to squeeze in a brutal civil war. That China was given the SKS by the Soviets, and they developed their own manufacturing capability through a licensed technology transfer. Now, it should be noted that this represented a significant shift in Soviet foreign policy, as the USSR under Joseph Stalin was strongly opposed to sharing modern military technology with anyone, even de facto allies like the Chinese. This is why in the immediate aftermath of World War II, economically challenged communist countries like China and Romania, as another example, initially wasted their time and resources producing domestic variants of the manually operated M44 Mosin. This is really all the Russians were willing to share at that time. It wasn't until Nikita Khrushchev ascended to power that the Kremlin recognized its strategic interest in freely disseminating more advanced military technology to ideologically sympathetic nations. This move was in large part a response to the looming Cold War and the fact that the United States was already pumping out their own weapons across Europe, Africa, Asia, and Latin America in an attempt to curry regional favor in the impending battle between burlap and blue jeans. Woe to be outcompeted, Khrushchev woke up the Soviet military-industrial titan from its slumber, and among many, many other measures, he issued en masse approvals to foreign technology transfer requests, including a pending Chinese request for the SKS-45. Meanwhile, in China, we must turn our attention to Chongqing, a southwestern population center about 600 miles north of the Vietnamese border. Chongqing was uniquely well-equipped for military manufacturing in the 1950s, as it had served as the provisional wartime capital for Chiang Kai-shek's government during the Japanese occupation. Most notably, it had become home to Factory 21, a large producer of Mauser pattern rifles during that war. It seems that Factory became State Arsenal 296 under the new communist regime under Mao Zedong and began producing a more fitting communist rifle, the Mosin pattern Type 53 carbine. For anyone who cares, they produced about 857,000 Type 53 carbines from 1953 to 1957, but that's a topic for another video. Little did anyone know at that time, but State Arsenal 296 had a date with destiny, which became apparent on January 11th, 1955, when the Chinese Central Military Commission received notice from the Soviet Union that they had been approved to receive immediate and full technological transfer of the SKS-45. Representatives of Tula, the legendary Russian arms plant about 100 miles south of Moscow, were prepared to dispatch tooling, components, complete technical data, and a team of technical advisors. The only thing they needed is to know where they were headed. As you can probably deduce from context, the Chinese Central Military Commission selected State Arsenal 296 to receive the Russians, a decision which proved to be among the most consequential in the history of small arms production. Over the next 15 months, State Arsenal 296 underwent an extremely professional and well-executed restructuring as they prepared to become the largest producer of SKS pattern carbines in human history. As a fun anecdote, the Soviet production model was based on a maximum annual output of 400,000 units, which host nations were encouraged to scale down as needed. From day one, the Chinese casually decided that they would instead prefer to double that, translating to a maximum production capacity of more than 15,000 rifles per week. Just for a sense of scale, Yugoslavia's legendary Zastava factory got the same technology transfer that the Chinese did, and it took them 7 years before they would have produced 15,000 rifles. Even at the peak of Yugoslavian production in 1974, it would take Zastava 3 months to produce the number of rifles which 296 could crank out in a single week. You know you are doing serious numbers when you make the Serbian Red Flag factory look like a mom-and-pop shop. The initial workforce at 296 exceeded 4,000 workers, a non-trivial percentage of whom were put through comprehensive Russian language courses which were conducted on site. This, of course, facilitated efficient communication between the indigenous personnel and their Soviet advisors. In March of 1956, the first batch of 101 trial rifles was produced, followed by a pre-production run of approximately 2,000 rifles, which were assembled on Soviet-made receivers. Often in the collector community, these are called the Sino-Soviets. I've talked about that in another video. With final adjustments in place, the factory was finally given a green light to shift gear and begin mass production. Thus began one of the most storied runs in the history of weapons manufacture, and the staggering flow of State Arsenal 296 produced Type 56 carbines would not come to a final stop until 1981, at which time just over 4 million units had been produced. I've said it before and I'll say it again, State Arsenal 296 was and always will be the most experienced and most successful producer of SKS pattern carbines, period. It's not that they made more than Tula, Izhevsk, Zastava, Gramsci, or Kujir. It's that they made more than Tula, Izhevsk, Zastava, Gramsci, and Kujir combined. The SKS is the third most produced autoloading rifle in history, and 1 in 4 of them came out of State Arsenal 296. So with all that context in place, we can finally circle back to the Ghost. The reason that all of that history was relevant is because the so-called Ghost variant is a physical testament to all of the historical events that I just described, and a time capsule to that critical period where it all started. So let's start breaking this down further. When we think of Chinese SKS patterns generally, we often think of distinctly Chinese features. A lot of guys will think of cruciform or spike-type bayonets, triangular arsenal marks, stamped trigger guards, and companies like Norinco and Polytech. Total SKS nerds, aka friends of this channel, might think of more subtle things like date codes, production numbers, 9 o'clock sling swivels, or short lug barrel interfaces. The thing is, all of those things which make the Chinese Type 56 carbine unique didn't happen overnight. These were the result of incremental changes informed by gradual shifts in geopolitics, national identity, and manufacturing technology. In many ways, what makes the Ghost variant special is precisely how removed it is from all of those distinctly Chinese elements. Almost all of those weird rules that we have to learn to understand the Chinese SKS, many of which I've based my channel around explaining, we throw all of those out when we look at the Ghost because the Ghost predates them. That's what makes it cool. In many ways, the Ghost is not really a Chinese Type 56 carbine, at least not in terms of its feature set. Rather, it's kind of a Soviet SKS-45, which just so happened to have been produced in China. These rifles were made by, in many cases, Russian-speaking workers who had not yet developed their own distinctly Chinese protocols, and instead were following Soviet protocols down to the letter, the Cyrillic letter in this case. Consequently, these so-called ghosts represent a powerfully symbolic and self-evident evolutionary link, which connects the Soviet ancestors to their Chinese descendants. That relationship is the crux of what makes these rifles desirable to collectors, although we go into that perspective later in this video. For now, let's dive into the nitty-gritty of actually just identifying these things. At a glance, the so-called Ghost variant most immediately resembles a non-refurbished, later pattern Soviet SKS-45. That is to say that if a knowledgeable SKS collector saw one at a distance, that might be their first guess as to what they were looking at. It has a long barrel lug, a blade bayonet, a 12 o'clock rear sling swivel, a birch stock, a one-piece gas tube, and lightning cuts everywhere, or everywhere you would reasonably expect to see lightning cuts. On the other hand, if someone inspected one from too close up, they might experience the same confusion. Up close, the Ghosts demonstrate a large amount of inspection marks and assembly numbers, a feature which is far more consistent with Soviet manufacture than it is with Chinese manufacture. Just as an example of what I'm talking about, here we're looking at 3 stocks. When we look closely, we can see that the Soviet and Ghost stock have more than a dozen inspection cartouches. They're easy to miss, but if you're looking for them, they are there, whereas the Chinese stock only has a couple. Doesn't matter how hard you look, you are not going to find anywhere near as many inspection marks on these later Chinese stocks. We can observe the same thing on a trigger group, whereas the Ghost and Soviet models have inspection marks on virtually every component, whereas the later Chinese generally only have 1, possibly 2 per assembly. Lastly, we can see all this repeated on the receiver, as the Soviet and Ghost examples have double-digit assembly numbers and inspection marks everywhere, whereas the later pattern Chinese is much more bare. One of the defining characteristics of Chinese manufacture was streamlining of the manufacturing process, and the Ghost is a physical record of where they started before they developed those iconic streamlining procedures. So with all that in place, you're probably wondering, how do we actually know that this is Chinese if all we've identified so far is that it has a ton in common with the Soviets? Well, the most obvious way is to look at the serial number, as Ghosts have a serial number format which is not seen on any other rifle which shares the previously established feature set. Unlike later pattern Soviet SKS 45s, Ghosts do not have a factory mark, nor do they use alphabetical prefix or suffix serialization. They instead are serialized using the most simple method available, which is an unembellished production number. In other words, Ghost serialization began at approximately 2000. Remember, we have to account for those first pre-production runs built on Soviet receivers, and it ended at approximately 214,000, and therefore every Ghost serial number will be a distinct figure within that range, approximately 211,000 distinct numbers. As an additional factor of note, unlike later Chinese production numbers, Ghost serial numbers do not include superfluous digits. Throughout the vast majority of Chinese production, the total number of digits in a production number would be fixed, almost always 5 or 6 digits, although exceptions exist. In other words, a production number corresponding to the 5,000th rifle manufactured in a given production block would be represented as 05000 or 005000. The Ghost did not include this element, as the Chinese were at this point most likely influenced by the Soviet policy of omitting zeros prior to the beginning of this number. Keeping in mind that Ghost serial numbers range from about 2,000 to about 214,000, we can deduce that all Ghost serial numbers begin with a number other than 0. We can additionally deduce that 4-digit Ghost serial numbers also cannot start with 1, because that would have put them in that initial pre-production range. Finally, 6-digit Ghost serial numbers do not start with anything other than a 1 or a 2, because all possible values are in the 100,000 or 200,000 range, because we cap out at around 214,000. Other defining characteristics of the Ghost variant are going to be the lack of a model designation, the lack of a Chinese arsenal mark of any kind, and the lack of a date code. Remember that the serial number is going to be a pure production number, not a production number combined with the date code. The presence of any of these things would preclude the possibility of it being a Ghost. That said, there is a common confusion which arises out of import marks. Ghosts have been imported at various times by various companies, so import-added Roman character alphabetical prefixes or suffixes really could throw somebody off, because as we've already established, original Ghost serial numbers would not include such features. In these cases, you really just need to visually discern that these letters are stamped separately from the original serial number. We're just trying to distinguish between what was originally marked on the rifle and what might have gotten added later, which doesn't reflect on the actual origin of the rifle. Luckily, discerning this is usually not too hard, because Ghosts tend to be overstruck. And what I mean by that is that these serial numbers are quite deep, and there's oftentimes a little bit of distinct flashing of shiny in the white metal, which gets displaced when a stamping goes really deep into steel. By contrast, import-added markings tend to be much more shallow, so it's usually not too hard to recognize that, oh, this was clearly stamped using a different tool at a different time than this. This is not a Ghost we're looking at, but it is an example of precisely what I'm talking about, in which the difference in marking depth between an original factory marking and an imported prefix is clearly visible. On Ghost examples, it'll often be even more obvious than it is here, so don't let this intimidate you. Additionally, anyone who has seen my video on Norinco will know that the phrase "made in China by Norinco," or whatever it says, refer to the picture, that was thrown on just about everything that Norinco exported, including military rifles, which were manufactured 25 years before Norinco existed. So it is absolutely possible to get Norinco markings on an original Ghost. That does not preclude a positive identification. Finally, the last major source of confusion is the fact that sometimes these weapons get refurbished while in military service, sometimes they get rebuilt for export, and sometimes they get sporterized and then desporterized while in civilian hands. So it's possible to find a rifle built on an original Ghost receiver, which has incorrect features that were added later on. For added confusion, parts can oftentimes be reserialized. In some cases, the Chinese were quite good at this, and force matching. I won't go through all of the possibilities here, and these are going to be pretty uncommon, but the point I'm trying to make is that while Ghosts are usually pretty straightforward to identify, there are always exceptions. And the only rule with Chinese SKSs is that there are always exceptions. In summary, the Ghost variant can generally be identified based on a combination of physical properties and serialization. Assuming that the rifle is original, you will see distinctly Soviet features, specifically a blade bayonet, long barrel lug, lightning cuts, a 12 o'clock sling swivel, and all of that will be in combination with a 4 to 6 digit numerical serial number, which is between the values of 2,000 and 214,000, with no superfluous digits, no arsenal mark, no Chinese character model designation, and no date code. If you're trying to identify a Ghost receiver which has been paired with otherwise non-original parts, your best bet is to verify that the receiver serial number is still correct according to the guidelines I just provided, and then inspect the receiver below the wood line for a high volume of inspection marks, more consistent with Soviet rather than Chinese manufacture. If you're having a really hard time, feel free to email me. My email address is in the description of this video. I'm sure I've accidentally ghosted a few of the people who've reached out before, and I have found a couple of rifles which I've had a little bit of trouble with, but the vast majority of rifles that come through my email, we can just do a really quick ID on. My overall batting average is quite good, so it's certainly worth a try if that's something you're interested in. So now that we've covered Ghost identification, let's talk a bit about the production numbers of the Ghost variant, as there are a couple of important lessons we can take away from those. Just in case anyone's been getting confused when I say production number, I'm referring to the component of the serial number which designates where that specific rifle fits into the total production block. At least on most Chinese Type 56 carbines, the production number would only be a component of the serial number, as it would be combined with a date code and a factory mark. I've got a decent video on this if you're interested. The whole point of the Ghosts, however, is that they don't have a date code or a factory mark, so the production number and the serial number are one and the same. More on why this is cool later. First, there is yet another thing which makes the production numbers of the Ghost series rifles different from virtually all other Chinese Type 56 carbines, and that is the fact that they did not reset when 1956 turned into 1957. State Arsenal 296 finished their first calendar year of production on rifle 84,010, and on the first day of 1957, they just rolled right along with rifle number 84,011. This is the only example I'm aware of in which the Chinese did not reset their production number to 0 for the beginning of a new year, and probably reflects the fact that 1956 was only a partial year of production. As a brief interjection, this is how you determine the date of manufacture on a Ghost variant. Super easy. Serial numbers 84,010 or lower are going to be made in 1956, and serial numbers 84,011 or higher are going to be made in 1957. Now, in order to really bring this all into focus, we now need to look at what else happened in 1957 that we haven't yet addressed. As we've previously established, 1957 saw the production of 128,000 Ghost rifles, serialized from 84,011 to approximately 214,000. Now, that final Ghost variant, rifle number 214,000 or so, did not mark the end of production in 1957, nor did it mark the end of that continual serialization block that we just talked about. Remember, the defining characteristic of the Ghost variant is the absence of a factory mark. So guess what State Arsenal 296 randomly decided to start incorporating onto their rifles right around number 214,000? You guessed it, the Triangle 26 Arsenal mark. This created a new, yet mostly arbitrarily defined variant, which is often called the 6-digit 26. These are going to be non-ghosts because they have the Triangle 26 Arsenal mark, therefore they're not spooky enough to be ghosts, yet they belong to the exact same production block as the Ghosts and are essentially identical to the Ghosts in every single way, except for the fact that they have a new marking, the Triangle 26 Arsenal mark, which would grace the receivers of State Arsenal 296 produced autoloading rifles for the foreseeable future. If that wasn't confusing enough, that's still not the last technically distinct variant, which was made in 1957. Somewhere around production number 340,000, yes, 340,000, they're really starting to pick up the pace now, the Chinese started to add a representational date code, specifically the number 2 in the millionths place. 2 in this case represents second year, and if the first year was 1956, the second year, of course, is still 1957. This created a hybrid 7-digit numerical serial number, which would prove to be the most enduring serial number format for decades to come, and is exactly the format which we generally expect when decoding the vast majority of Chinese SKS pattern carbines. By the time 1957 finally drew to a close, this original serialization block was all the way up to production number 420,000 or so, which was finally reset to 0 for the beginning of 1958. It was possible to reset the production number because the date code, which of course had just been implemented, was now changed. So the date code for 1958 was 3 third year, and therefore they could recycle previously used production numbers because in the presence of a distinct date code, it would still result in a unique and identifiable serial number. For those of you hastily doing math on the back of a napkin at home, let me help you out. What we just learned is that the so-called Ghost variant only represents about half of the 420,000 rifles which were manufactured between 1956 and 1957 and constituted the first ever uninterrupted production block from about 0 to about 420,000. In addition to the 212 or so thousand Ghosts, which we've already established, and the 2,000 or so pre-production models, which we've already established, there are an additional 125,000 or so so-called 6-digit 26s. These are the ones serialized between 214,000 and 340,000, roughly. Those are going to have 6-digit serial numbers in that range with a triangle 26 arsenal mark. And we have an additional 80,000 or so of the 2 million date-coded rifle. And those are going to have a 7-digit numerical serial number starting with a 2, with a 6-digit production number. That's going to be the last 6 digits of the 7-digit serial number, in that range of 340,000 to 420,000. And it is also going to have that triangle 26 marking, but they're all part of the same production run, and that's what I'm trying to emphasize here. Those later production 1957 rifles are not technically Ghosts, but only because the whole point of the Ghost is a rather arbitrary distinction, which is the presence of an arsenal marker date code, or the absence, I should say, of an arsenal marker date code. However, at the end of the day, what I'm really trying to emphasize here is that all of those categories of rifle I just mentioned, all of those 420,000 rifles made from mid-1956 to the very last day of 1957, some collectors ignore about half of them, but those rifles all have far more in common than they have keeping them separate. And that segues us very nicely into the next subject of discussion, which is considerations for collectors. At a certain level, the collector appeal of the Ghost variant is pretty obvious. As I mentioned earlier, it represents a rather poignant evolutionary link between the Soviet SKS-45 and the Chinese Type 56 carbine, and therefore it appeals to people who are interested in the mechanical and geopolitical development of the platform as a whole, the Simonov platform specifically. Furthermore, for SKS enthusiasts who share my rather particular affinity for the rifles manufactured at State Arsenal 296, the Ghost obviously takes on additional significance. I find owning a Ghost to be fulfilling in very much the same way that I found owning a Peter Forsberg rookie card to be fulfilling when I was a kid. I can't quite put my finger on it, but there is clearly a special appeal to feeling connected to the humble origins of something which turned out to be a big deal. I think on a very basic human level, there's something deeply inspiring about this, whether it's looking at a picture of a 21-year-old Swedish kid who would go on to be one of the greatest playmakers in NHL history, or you're holding a rifle that went from being 1 in 84,000 to being 1 in 10 million. These are huge, tremendous changes, and it's cool to feel connected to that. All that said, I think these are pretty obvious observations. Either you have the collector bug or you don't. And if you do have it, the last thing you need is me giving you more reasons to add something to your collection. That's what my friends' wives tell me anyway. Apparently, I'm a terrible influence on their otherwise fiscally responsible husbands. Instead, for the purpose of this video, I think it might be far more interesting to talk about some of the aspects of Ghost collecting that don't make so much sense, because I do think that some of the appeal of the Ghost is surprisingly arbitrary. For whatever reason, the Ghost seems to be far more popular than the 6-digit 26s or the 2 million date-coded guns, and that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Sure, there is some novelty in having a Chinese rifle which lacks certain markings, but in my opinion, the feature of the Ghost which is most historically significant and collectible is not actually limited to the Ghost specifically. It doesn't have to do with those markings. In my opinion, by far the coolest feature of the so-called Ghost rifle is the fact that they have a production number which belongs to the first ever production block and therefore corresponds to total national production. In other words, if you happen to have a Ghost with a serial number 23456, that is literally the 23,456th Type 56 carbine to ever have been produced in China. My Ghost, which you've been seeing throughout this video, is in the 73,000 block, which means that it is one of the first 74,000 Chinese Type 56 carbines ever to be produced, which is another way of saying that it's older than 99% of all Chinese SKS pattern carbines on the planet. That's the coolest thing about Ghost to me, and that is equally true about the more than 200,000 non-Ghosts, which were also made in 1957. Whether your 1956 or 1957 Type 56 carbine production number is 4 or 400,000, when you look at that number, that is exactly the number of Chinese SKS patterns that were manufactured before yours, out of a total number of 10 million. And that is super cool. So what's the takeaway of all this? Well, it means that although the Ghosts are super cool, and the Ghosts are super cool, most of what makes them cool is their history, and their history is shared by a couple of other variants, which don't often get the credit they deserve. If only 6-digit 26s were called demigorgons and 2 million blocks were called jackalopes, maybe they would get the attention they deserve, but it is what it is. Collectors are weird sometimes, and occasionally we put too much value on stories and not enough value on history. In summary, the primary theoretical basis for Ghosts' collectability is their status as being part of the first ever production block, but it seems clear that having a cool sounding nickname also plays a significant role, because there's a couple 100,000 other rifles which belong to that same first production block that don't get the same attention as Ghosts. Do with that information what you will. Lots of great variants out there to collect. So the very last consideration I want to touch on before wrapping up this video is the relative quality of Ghosts, specifically compared to other Chinese Type 56 carbines. The claim has often been made that Ghosts are of significantly higher quality than their younger Chinese peers, and as usual, I have some thoughts about that. Viewers of my relative quality series will probably know that I'm generally pretty dismissive of quality claims when it comes to SKS pattern carbines. It's been my experience over tens of thousands of rounds through dozens and dozens of Chinese examples that their quality was pretty darn consistent and pretty darn good from start to finish. And I've noticed a really significant crossover between the people who disagree with the experiences I've had significantly. There's always room for additional subtlety and nuance, but the people who really seem 100% clear that Chinese quality deteriorated quickly over time. When I talk to them for longer periods, it's almost always the same people who like to have conversations about the stopping power of pistol rounds and about how the grand ping was getting people killed in World War II. My opinions are always evolving. I try to challenge myself. I try to test myself. However, I absolutely maintain my core position that if you're using an SKS pattern carbine in a situation which even remotely resembles the real life scenarios that they were engineered for, the vast majority of so-called quality differences are academic. You are not going to observe a consequential difference in performance, whether you have a Ghost, a 1965 or 1969 Type 56 carbine that got pulled out of an Albanian warehouse, or you've got a late 80s commercial conventional carbine slapped together full of parts from who knows where. They all work great. That said, the Ghosts do have an aesthetic quality to them, which is hard to ignore. I personally think that all Type 56 carbines have their own flavor of charm, but I'll readily admit that the really early ones, like the Ghosts, as well as the other 1957 and even the 1958 ones, they do have a distinctly old world feel to them, which is pretty special. Not better necessarily, but certainly special. I've said it before and I'll say it again. If I could only own one SKS pattern, it would probably be this one. It would be a hard choice. Pick me on a different day, I might give you a different answer. But a lot of the times I choose this one. And that's mostly because I think it has the coolest history, but it certainly doesn't hurt that it is extremely well made and it looks nice too. Finally, I would be remiss to not mention that in my fairly comprehensive head-to-head SKS accuracy test, which involved, I think it was 10 rifles spread out from various countries, factories, and decades of manufacture, this Ghost rifle did emerge as the overall champion, which surprised me because of its collector value. I don't shoot it much, and it absolutely mopped the floor with the other ones. It didn't mop the floor, but it did come out on top. Again, I reiterate that I do not think this translates into anything resembling truly significant performance increases. However, there may be a seed of truth to the idea that the Chinese were really nailing their tolerances when their tooling was fresh and some guy named Ivan was looking over their shoulder. I'm cautious with that whole perspective because while I think there is some truth to it, it's also true to say that 20 odd years later, State Arsenal 296 would be objectively a more experienced producer of SKS pattern carbines anyway. So the idea of Russian presence being beneficial, it becomes counterintuitive because at that point the Russians knew less about making SKSs than the Chinese did, and that is absolutely reflected in the final State Arsenal 296 production, looking at a 1979 French Tickler or a 1979 M21. Those are phenomenally beautiful rifles in their own way, so there certainly wasn't anything resembling a steady deterioration in quality if there was any shift it would be a very shallow convex curve, I would say, which even still I don't like hearing myself say, because mid-1960s and late 1960s State Arsenal 296 Type 56 carbines are also excellent. So you kind of see where I'm coming from. Of we can acknowledge that there's differences, and we can acknowledge that some are particularly special, but it's really hard to find where these bad ones are. And that's about it, guys. I'm sure there's more that could be covered and maybe will be covered in future videos, but that's all I've got for today. As usual, if you found this video to be worth your time, I would greatly appreciate if you could do any combination of liking, subscribing, and commenting. My personal life is a little hectic right now, but I do have more SKS and non-SKS content coming down the pipeline soon, as well as some long overdue stripper clip giveaways and the announcement about an online shop, which is going to have SKS stripper clips and maybe a couple other SKS related stuff. I can't promise exactly when things are going to happen, but I will say that the subscribe button in particular accomplishes two things. One, it motivates the heck out of me. When I see that number go up, I'm like, oh, wow, people actually kind of care about this. I should stop what I'm doing and be more productive. And the other thing is it lets you know when things come out, so it makes sure you don't miss anything that does get done when it is available. So until next time, guys, thank you so much for taking the time to check out this video, and I sincerely hope you have a great rest of your day.